So, just had to get that out there, because if you watched my previous video, you should know that's exactly how I'm going to start all my videos. Anyway, hello and welcome to the second installment of the Kerbal Space Program tutorial videos that I'm working on. These are unscripted, by the way, so don't mind me rambling on about nothing like this. Going to be talking about some basic orbital maneuvers today, as well as actual orbital mechanics, such as the Oberth effect, which is simulated in KSP. We'll be talking about things like gravity turns, proper launch sequence, retrograde orbit, prograde orbit, circularization, parking orbits, eccentricity, inclination, how to change your inclination, and Hohmann transfers, which were named after the German scientist Walter Hohmann. So we're going to get in the game here. I'm Fox, by the way, Aphox on the forums, A-P-H-O-X if you'd like to find me. Obviously, Aphox CV here on YouTube, and I'm not going to explain what the CV means because it would take too long. Okay, I'm going to start with my ship that I know can make it into space. Where is it? There it is. Need to zoom out a bit. There we go. Oh, and I guess I could take that off for now, since you guys obviously probably aren't using Cart quite yet. Cart's mod, you can find it in the mods section and under plugin powered mods on the KSP forums. Very nice. Gives you little rovers like this. This rover here, the actual cart, which has, I believe, headlights pre-installed. These also have the controls and the descriptions. Use the RCS translation keys. And they supposedly have cute cruise control, but I've never been able to get it to work. But the headlights are really nice. Look at that. It's got this, got RCS tanks for this, which I actually forgot to install on this. And ooh, there's a UAZ now. Neat. Anyway, I'll be taking this off of here, just so we can get a normal moon lander going here. I'm just going to use this bottom stage right here for the moon landing. Ooh, this is actually designed for interplanetary travel, which is why I have this Nerva engine on here. I'll talk about that real quick, actually. The Nerva engine is by far the most efficient engine when it's in space. In the description there you can see it has a specific impulse of 800 in a vacuum, which means its efficiency is much higher in space than in any of the other available engines. 330 on this one, for example. This one's got 390, 320, oh, that was the wrong value, 370, 370, 330, 390. They're all these were all pretty good until this thing came out. It only has 60 thrust, but it is very good. Specific impulse, you can find the definition of that on Wikipedia. Basically, it is a number in seconds of how efficient the engine is. I'm not going to go into the math behind it because it's pretty complicated and hard to explain. But basically, the higher the number, the better the efficiency. So, I don't need that right now because I'm not going interplanetary, and I can actually go interplanetary with this thing, which is still fairly efficient in fuel, which is nice. Actually, I can make it to the moon with that thing. So just to make this thing not so top-heavy, I'm going to put a smaller fuel tank here, and I'm going to put some lander legs on here, little tiny ones, because I don't need huge ones. I'm going to put 4 of them just for some extra stability. This thing should be able to land pretty well, actually. And I will not be using the MacJeb just to demonstrate that all of this is possible without autopilot, and I'm going to make that perfectly clear in my future videos. You can do anything in this game without autopilot. And I want everyone to be perfectly aware of that. Just so, I mean, it's okay to rely on it, but you want to not rely on it just so you can brag about it, you know? You could be like, I got to the moon without autopilot, friend of mine, how about you? And they're like, well, I haven't watched Fox's tutorial videos, so I can't say the same thing. And then you'll be able to brag. And then you'll show them my channel, and I'll get more viewers and subscribers, and then I'll be able to teach more people, which is good. I'm going to turn these, because I don't like the way these things are working right now. I turned these in the last video, I think. Raised them up a little bit, and I don't like how they worked. I'm gonna put them back down. Oh, I didn't want to do that. Get out of here. Control Z, undo, just like I had described before. What I didn't describe before is you can also Control Y, just like you can in basically any application that has an undo feature, to redo. Slide these things down a little bit, because I kind of liked where they were before. What? I don't... Stop that. You got reversed. It's not okay. Can't do that to me. I'm Fox. Okay. Looking good here. Looks like we're ready to go. Make sure everything's in order. You always want to double check everything before you go on your way. I'm actually going to remove this structural support here. Huh? What? What did I just pick up? Not that one. The reason I'm removing these is because it's attached to... Oh, there must have just been another one sitting in there. That's really strange. There we go. These get attached to certain parts. As you can see, before I took the top part off, it had two of these engines attached. And struts, when connected incorrectly, or in the wrong spots, we actually figured this out in the TeamSpeak channel earlier. There is a public TeamSpeak channel for KSP, by the way. It's a community TeamSpeak channel. You can find the address for it in the general forums, the general discussion forum under the main forum. I will post a... Actually, no, that's probably not a good idea. Just go look for it. Anyway, we figured out while I was playing that I had structural support struts inside of this collision cone here, or inside of this rocket cone, which is inside the collision mesh. And that prevented my rockets from thrusting at all. They generated absolutely no thrust. They would turn on, they would use fuel, you could see the flames, but nothing would happen. And it's because they were inside the cone. There's a pretty large collision box around this cone, and you can put it... I wouldn't put it back here just to be safe, but you can put it pretty much anywhere out here, we found out, and they will still operate correctly. Well, I don't know about that, but even after the struts are separated with your staging, they will still have parts, these little nubs remaining, and those can actually severely interfere with everything, so I just wanted to get those off of my landing gear so nothing bad happened there. So that's my new word. I use that a lot. Before you leave the VAB, you want to make sure everything's in order. You want to look over here to make sure all of your yeah, that's exactly why. This decoupler here was on the same activation stage as my engine, which would have ended very badly, because when I activate my engine, it would have decoupled the command pod, and I would just float into nothing, and whoever the brave Kerbal is to go to the moon would die, or just, float around forever, since they don't have to eat, apparently. Maybe those little cans of mayonnaise in the corner are infinite. I don't know. So we're just going to do a quick run over. Everything down here I know is okay, because I've used this several times. The guys on the channel earlier were actually commenting on my silly sideways tanks here. The reason I did that was because I had them upright just like these ones, and I had these engines on the bottom, and obviously they were interfering with these cones here, and I didn't like that, and I didn't like the way they looked like this. They seemed kind of cumbersome and stupid, so I turned them sideways and made them work like a boss. And put a ridiculous amount of fuel ducts all over them, but that's okay, because they weigh nothing and they're very useful. I don't need one on both sides of each of these tanks, but I put them there anyway because I like symmetry. I am a symmetrical person, although I'm really not. My face has things on one side that it doesn't have on the other side. Anyway, how did you raise up? that doesn't really matter where this is unless you have launch struts connected. Actually, I'm gonna put a few of these on here because this thing likes to wiggle around before I launch, and I don't like that. So I'm gonna put one of these on each side just for my symmetry. Make sure my engines aren't clipping. Well, actually, I don't think it matters if they clip, but I'm just gonna touch them down right there. And that should keep it from moving for the most part. And like I said, no mech jib here, no autopilot. I'll be doing this completely manually. I've actually gained the capacity to do that after playing for a while now, which I'm proud of, actually. Alright, I spent a little longer in the VAB that I actually wanted to. But, one of my new subscribers, hello you, instructed me that he likes my rambling, so I think I'll just ramble about things, because apparently you guys learn from that, so I'm going to keep rambling about things. Alright, if you haven't watched the previous video, I'll go through the basics here. I'm going to turn on the SAS, which keeps me from falling over when I get in the air. Very nice. As you can see, it's already trying to keep itself from tipping over, which it's not doing, but I'm going to throttle up to full. Actually, I'm going to tap control real fast so my engines don't begin to overheat. Just because that little tiny bit of throttle doesn't really matter, at least not to me. And we're going to launch. Oh, see, this is exactly why you want to check over everything before you leave the VAB. These pre-launch struts, the little stability enhancer things, are way up here in my staging because they're up on these fuel tanks and it thinks that they're part of this stage, which I don't understand. So we're going to leave because that wasted a bunch of lifting fuel. And come over here. I want to move these way down there. See, I didn't even follow my own advice and check those. Now, some people will have those, will have their engines activate before the struts release. And that's fine. If you have the amount of fuel to do that, or your finger's fast enough to tap the space bar, that's fine. You can do that. I don't suggest it, honestly, because it wastes a little bit of fuel that I don't want to waste. It works perfectly fine if you throttle up and just release like this. And you'll notice that this has a really slow takeoff. Really slow takeoff. I think its initial velocity is about 25 or so meters per second, which isn't very fast for a rocket. But hey, it gets very far, it has a lot of fuel to get pretty far. It has a huge delta V budget. It can pretty much go anywhere. Delta V is another thing I want to explain. It's another one of those things like specific impulse that has a lot of very complex math behind it, and even more so in this case. It's basically, Wikipedia defines it as a change in momentum. It's kind of like how much you can move. How far your rocket can go is your delta V budget. And you lose delta V by adding more weight, but you gain more by adding more fuel and thrust. It's a very complicated math problem, and it's, in this game, as far as I can tell, it's solved by trial and error, unless you're a scientist who likes to do a lot of math. And I'm kind of too lazy to do all that math, so I don't really mind playing around with it and doing that for myself. And plus, you know, it's a video game, so you don't want it to be too easy mode for you, right? You want a little bit of a challenge. Get up there, get into space. Now, if you notice, I'm not using Time Warp up here, and this is a new feature, by the way. Well, it's not new, it was in the old versions. They took it away in 16, 0.16, simply because it caused a lot of problems. It was very stressful in the physics engine, and it would cause your crafts to collapse and do all sorts of crazy things. And it works for the most part now, but for heavier, larger ships, I don't think this one's too affected by it, but I'm not going to risk it. For heavy ships, it doesn't work very well. They will literally rattle themselves to pieces. They will just jiggle up and down and explode. It's catastrophic and a little bit hilarious. I might actually demonstrate it later. Hell, I might demonstrate it once I get into orbit, because it's just funny. And so, right now, this is, I I'm not even paying attention to doing my own thing. What I'm doing right now is called a gravity turn. It's where you pitch in the direction while you're still in orbit, or while you're still in your atmospheric flight. You pitch the direction you want your orbit to go in, so you start to gain some momentum in that direction. So you're not straight up and down when you actually get into orbit. I usually start my gravity turns at 20,000 to 25,000 meters, or 25 kilometers, and I usually end them around 65 or 70. And you want to watch the map pretty closely to get to your desired apogee or apoapsis, however you want to call it. I'm leaning in the wrong direction because large ships are very hard to maneuver when they don't have a thruster turned on. What happened? Why isn't my thruster? Oh, I'm out of fuel. Okay, that makes sense. So it looks like my maximum apogee right now is 193,000 meters. Plus or minus, 890. So we're going to coast up here. We're going to go into time warp, and we're just going to coast to, what was it? 193. So I'm going to coast to 190 and start to get positioned, or 185 or so. And you can turn on time warp to do this. The time warp modes outside of the atmosphere are not physical. They are very, very different from the atmospheric time modes. These will not shake your ship to pieces, although they have in a few cases. A few bugs have popped up in this version where when you're orbiting and you go into 100,000x, and you come out of 100,000x very quickly, your ship will have exploded randomly. It's very random. It's not very reproducible, but it happens a lot. Well, not a lot, just often. A little too often, if you ask me. But, it is, and it's still an alpha stage, and that's the point of what we're doing here. I'm teaching you, and earlier I found some bugs, and I've reported them, which is good for an alpha. You want people looking for bugs, and you want people reporting those bugs. So I urge you guys to participate in finding bugs for KSP so it can improve. You can report any bugs to the bug report section under support in the forums, and the developers will look at them and they'll find the problem and they'll fix it, usually. Okay, see right here, this scares me. I have struts inside of my engine cone. They don't affect it on these engines because the cones and the collision mesh are a little different. So I'm going to line up with my 90-degree axis, how I've been lined up the whole time. That's another thing I forgot to go through. This game moves really quickly when you're going. I should have explained that before launch, but I'll explain it when I get into orbit here. So I'm almost at my apogee, and I'm just going to start the thrust right now because I know I'm gonna lose some. I'm gonna lose a few kilometers trying to circularize here. And you can see that gravity turn had a significant effect on my parabola here. It extended my orbit quite a bit. Without gravity turning, I probably would have ended up over here somewhere. So that helps a lot, actually, with your circularization stage. I'm going to pitch a little bit farther down towards the exact horizon, and that just maximizes your straight-out vector. So I'm not trying to point up to gain altitude. As you can see, I just started falling. I actually gained a little more altitude because I was pointing up, just slightly. And I'm trying very hard to keep on exact 90 so I can have a very precise equatorial orbit, which is required for moon transfer. I also forgot to explain that. Man, I'm bad at this. Equatorial orbit is absolutely required for moon... Well, it's not. If you have tons of fuel, it's not. But if you're new to the game, you want to get as close to an equatorial orbit as you possibly can in order to get a decent moon transfer. And we went through orbit in the last tutorial, so I'm not going to go too heavy on what I'm doing right now. Just circularizing here, getting my eccentricity down. That's another thing I'll explain. Eccentricity is a term that describes how circular your orbit is. An eccentricity of 0 is perfectly circular, which is, to my knowledge, impossible to attain, and will make these two little symbols here freak out and go around in circles. An eccentricity of 1 is straight up and down, to my knowledge. I've had eccentricities of 57 before. I'm not sure how that happened or what it means. Oh, that was when my perigee actually was inside of the planet. which is really strange. So we've got 187,000 here and 247,000 here, which is not zero eccentricity. It's very elliptical. Eccentricity describes the ellipticalness of your orbit. So I'm gonna go over here to my perigee, so I can get this exact. Because where you thrust from, when you thrust at a certain point on your pro or retrograde markers, it will affect exactly on the other side. It will affect the exact opposite axis. I'm going to turn on RCS here so I stop spinning around so much. So when I thrust here at my perigee, it will directly affect my apoapsis, or apogee. If anybody knows the difference between these two terms, please tell me, or if they just mean the same thing. Someone should shed a light on this. I'm pretty good with English, but when it comes to space terms, I'm an idiot. Alright, I talked too long, so I'm drifting past my perigee since I'm going 2155 right now. So I'm gonna prograde here and bring down the size of this orbit and try to get it as circular as I can, because it's always good to have a circular orbit, but you never want to waste too much fuel trying to circularize. It's not extremely important unless you're doing very advanced maneuvers that require absolute circularization. As you can see, you can't go into certain time warp modes at certain heights in the orbit. So when you're in time warp, your ship will spin when you're in orbit, so you'll have to readjust to your apoapsis, or retrograde or prograde. MechJeb has buttons for this. You can set to lock onto your prograde, retrograde, normal or anti-normal axes, which we will talk about later. So what are we at? We're at 173, so I'm going to try to get this down a little bit more. There we go. That's what happens when you start to eccentrize. Eccentric. You know what I mean. It starts spinning around in circles and gets kind of crazy. Anyway, we're at a pretty good orbit here. The most basic way, which is what we're going to do, of getting to the moon without having to do lots of math or use phase angles that aren't available to you, or using an on-screen protractor like I used to for interplanetary transfer. The best way is to time warp around the planet until the moon pops up over the horizon. So we're going to do that right now. Don't want to overshoot it too far, so kind of slow yourself down when you think you're going to come up on it. Where's mine on the map? So we should be seeing it around here, this midpoint right here. So we're going to go ahead and jump right over there. When this happens, the moon should be about on a 3 o'clock from the planet. If you're looking at it straight down, it'll be also on a 3 o'clock from your ship, looking at it straight down. So, nope, there it is. Slow down. So as you can see, it's well, that was inaccurate. That was pretty inaccurate. It's around there though. Anyway, we've got it in sight, and we're going to turn prograde, which is the reticle here that does not have the X through it. It's the little yellow one. Stop it, RCS, stop it. Turn prograde and keep on our 90. And you can see the heading down here is 89. I'm just going to slightly adjust that back up to 90, just so we don't incline our orbit. And we're going to full throttle. Turn off the RCS and hold full throttle. And what this does is, since the moon is constantly spinning around the planet, it puts our orbit into an intercept course with the moon. And then I'll show you what happens when we get there. Now this will move pretty slowly. This is where the Oberth effect comes in handy. The faster, I explained this in the last one, the faster you're going, the more effective your rocket is the basic gist of it. So you can see here I'm gaining speed. I'm getting a lot of speed, and so this is starting to move faster and faster and faster and faster, and eventually when it gets way out here, it'll be moving super fast at this much thrust, which is bad, because you want to make really slight adjustments. See that right there? There's our encounter. Moon encounter, moon escape, and then we go back into orbit around Kerbal. If you do it right, you can actually use the moon as a gravity slingshot and launch yourself into the sun. not into the sun, but into the sun's orbit. So what you can do here is you boost a little bit on your prograde or retrograde, depending on your situation. X is throttle cutoff, by the way, very useful for these situations. We're going to boost prograde to get this periapsis closer and closer, and you see this purple line here. This is my conics patch limit. I changed this so I can see my future orbits and encounters. Very useful for interplanetary. Each line past the line the blue line is more and more inaccurate, so you can't really rely on these too much, but they're still extremely useful and worth the change. Very, very easy on your brain meats, as one guy would put it. So we're going to keep boosting this here a little bit at a time, since my boosters are pretty powerful. They're making a large change with very small amount of thrust. This orbit's looking really strange. I'm going to try to get this thing within 50,000 meters. If you don't get it as close as I do, that's perfectly fine. I didn't get anywhere near the moon the first few times I tried. But I'm going to keep... Oh, and you can find the craft file to my ship if you want it in the last video. I'm going to demonstrate something here. If you get too close or go through it, this is a direct intercept course. I will smash into the moon like this. You see there's no periapsis. This is a direct shot into the moon. I can land like this. But I'm going to teach you how to get into orbit. But if you ever want to shoot directly into the moon, that's how you do it. And yeah, that's not going to happen. We're not going to escape from the moon on that course. If you go too far past that course, let's see, how much fuel do I have left? Can I do this? Oh yeah, I have a ton of fuel. You see this? I have these. I have this, those two, and these two. All of those. It's a lot of fuel. This thing is very, very capable. So I suggest you download it if you aren't capable of creating something better yourself. What is going on here? Anyway, well, I'm not gonna do this because it's getting confusing. What will happen is if you go too far past your encounter, it will encounter the other direction, and so you'll have to retrograde like I'm doing right now to make up for that. And with these methods, you can get yourself as close as you want. The only downside to that is some of the other planets have atmospheres, and if you get too close, you will get aero-braked into the planet. And that's not always the best of things. 60,000 meters, 60 kilometers, that's good enough. So that'll happen if you don't pay attention to what you're doing. So, yeah, we're just going to time warp up towards the moon here, and you can see it's actually over here, but our encounter is going to be over here just because, you know, how orbits work, space and stuff like that, and this always happens. Right there it lags. So don't turn your time warp up too high. I'm going to tell you that right now. It will lag at certain points in the time warp, and you may or may not overshoot your target. I've done it hundreds of, well, maybe not hundreds, but I've done it several times. It's very discouraging. It'll mess you up pretty hard, and if you're not a quick save buff, I'm not, definitely not. Okay, see, that just changed. That was really strange, but we're looping around here. We've been captured by the planet, or by the moon, and it's lowered my periapsis by 5 kilometers, so always leave some room there, because those lines aren't always accurate. So we're going to come up to our periapsis here, which is where we'll be going the fastest, and this we'll be able to utilize the O-berth effect to its fullest at this point, which we need, because there's not very much speed here, and you're going to need as much thrust as possible to get into orbit around the moon. So what you want to do now is turn retrograde. Retrograde will always shrink your orbit, and when you're on an escape trajectory like this, the moon's escape trajectory is very low because it has very low gravity. On a retrograde, and this will bend in and in and in, and then eventually pop! It'll turn into a circle, and then you just keep burning a little bit. And I'm going to circularize this as much as I can. So we're coming down to 55,000 here. Getting close. I'm going to burn a little bit. And there we go. There we go. We're around the moon. Hopefully you're following along still, and you're understanding all this and I'm explaining everything all right, and if I'm not, please let me know. So this is where the game gets hard. Oh, another reason you don't want to get too close to the planet is because if you have your graphics turned up, or if you have an older machine, once I get around 10 kilometers of the moon, it'll start to lag really badly. If you have terrain scattering turned on, that's even worse because it loads in all those rocks and all that kind of stuff, and the trees on Kerbin. It loads in all the ground textures, which really is hard on your machine when you're going this fast. Oh, actually, it's not a problem at this speed, but if you're in time warp and you come out of the map, see, you can see it down here. There's a square right here where it's loading in slightly more high-resolution textures of the moon compared to over here. And that puts stress on your machine. It does. I have a pretty high-class machine, so it's not really doing anything for me right now. Even while recording, I get pretty crappy frame rates on most games when I record, but this is okay. So this is the hardest part, is the moon landing, because it's really hard, as you saw in the last video, to actually get a proper landing spot. Especially on the moon, there's a lot of mountains, there's a lot of craters. I've always been told to land in the crater, but I've never actually done it, because they don't seem as flat as they're not as flat as they seem. Why did I do that? I don't want to target the moon. Your landing site is usually going to be a few degrees off of your exact opposite location. So like, if I were to retrograde right here, my landing site would probably be, depending on how far I retrograded, around here. Since I'm going counterclockwise, I'm in a retrograde orbit around the moon. You can reverse this if you have tons of fuel. There's really no point to doing it. We're going to try to land up here. So this is where I'm going to teach you inclination changes. Now, inclination is basically your relative spin, I guess you could call it, your relative rotation to the equator, I guess. Basically, it's how far inclined your orbit is. So we're slightly inclined here. This is probably like a 3-degree inclination. Adjusting inclines is always easier on the apoapsis of your orbit, because it's more efficient to change inclines at slower speeds. The Oberth effect does not work for inclination changes. It's actually the opposite. And it also it's kind of complicated where you are in respect. Basically, you go normal or anti-normal, which I should have turned the mech jeb on for that, because I'm really not good at finding normal and anti-normal on inclinations other than 0. Normally, normal and anti-normal are your 180, and what is on the opposite side of 180? I'm really bad with circular angles. That's embarrassing. Basically, it's the N. It's the north, I guess you could call it, on the nav ball, which is 0, I believe. Yeah, it's 180 and 0. I could have figured that out. I'm really bad at angles. So normal or north on your nav ball will. It's kind of hard to explain. You might have to play with it to figure out which direction they're going, but I'm going to guess that this is going to force my apoapsis to go up. Normal will push your inclination towards the north pole of whatever you're orbiting, like this. See it going? See, we're turning here. This is the inclination happening. And I'm probably not on perfect normal, since this wasn't a completely eccentric orbit, or not eccentric, but 0 inclination orbit. See, it's not really doing much, but it's also really increasing my apoapsis a lot, which isn't good. That's really not good. I must not be on complete normal. I really wish I had. The mech jeb also has settings for that. It'll take you to your exact normal and anti-normal, or north and south. I've really messed this up because I haven't learned how to locate those yet. So I'm learning at the same time you are. I'm just a little farther ahead. So this is bad because this is extended so far now. Actually, I believe normal and anti-normal are 90 degrees from your pro and retrograde. So see, this is anyway. The reason this is bad is because I've extended my apogee so far that I have to use a lot of delta V in fuel, which isn't really a problem with this thing, obviously, to shrink that, and that's not good. Alright, I apologize. I lied. I said these are going to be short and sweet, at least shorter than the last one, and it turns out they were almost twice as long as the last one. I just got this into my video editor. It's an hour and 18 minutes long, so we're going to take a break right here. And please tune in for part 2. It's not that I have an issue uploading a file this long. My account is enabled for it, but you know, nobody wants to sit here for an hour and 18 minutes, so go take a break, get a soda, get some popcorn, and come back and watch the rest.